All right, welcome back. So what I have here is Android Studio opened, and I've just created a basic empty project. There's nothing different. It's just with the empty activity, just the same as what we've done in the past weeks. Except now our goal is we're going to define two different fragments. Now I'm not going to do the same fragments as your homework assignment. You're not going to get off quite that easy. We want to start a little bit simpler. So our goal for this particular demo is we're going to create two different fragments. One fragment will have a button, and the second fragment will have a text field that we will update programmatically to tell the user when the button has been pressed. Okay? So let's go ahead and do both of that. Now, making fragments is actually pretty easy. When you're in the Android view, we can right-click here on our app side, and we're going to choose New. We're going to scroll down here to the bottom and choose Fragment. Now there's several different options. You have a fragment blank, list with a +1 button, and modal bottom sheet. Okay. For now, we're going to pick just fragment with blank. Okay. We want an empty fragment, meaning Android, give us the simplest, most smallest, most basic thing for our fragment. Okay. So let's go ahead and make a blank fragment. And now I'm going to create this fragment. I'm going to call this one fragment button. Okay. Now sometimes I like to put fragment in front of it. Other people like to say button fragment. I only like this one just because it makes a little bit when I'm looking in my code views, everything's organized, grouped. All my fragments are together. All my activities are together. However, the downside is it puts fragment underscore your other name. So you should fix that if you decide to go this way. If you prefer to go to button fragment instead, that's acceptable as well. Now, two things we want to do though. First off, we want to make sure we create this layout XML. However, uncheck both the fragment callback methods and the interface callbacks. Okay, if you unselect both of those options, otherwise if you select them, it's going to auto-generate a whole bunch of code that's going to confuse the daylights out of you and not really do any good. Okay, rather than having auto-generated interface callbacks, we're gonna write them by hand so that you really understand what's happening for now. Okay, so we're gonna push finish. And Android Studio is gonna take a minute here and think. Apparently, there we go. All right, and we've got a blank fragment. Now, a fragment consists of two pieces. First off, we have a fragment itself, which is the code that will drive the fragment, and also it will have made a layout file, which will be the layout that drives the fragment itself. By default, it is just blank. A couple of things I want to note, though. Okay, if I expand our imports out here, and this is something to pay careful attention to, because otherwise, I guarantee we'll bite several of you if you're not paying close attention. There are two different fragment classes in Android. First, there is android.support.v4.app.fragment. And they're going to be changing these package names later this summer. It's in alpha right now to call it Android X. So you won't have these version numbers because that's the worst design decision they could have made, to put versioning numbers in the package names. In fact, it was kind of funny at I/O. They were making fun of themselves for that stupid decision. But anyways, so there's the support library version of fragments. That is what you want to use. Okay. The other version, the other option, if you ever see anything dealing with fragments and you see something called android.app.fragment, okay, don't use that one. While it will work when you target newer APIs, basically anything we're going to target in this class would be fine. The problem is it's become too cumbersome for Google to manage backwards compatibility with android.app.fragment. So they are going to deprecate that and force everybody to use the support library, or what they're calling now Jetpack. So you're going to want to make sure you're in that. So later on, when you're dealing with importing things related to fragments, or using fragment managers or other things, as you'll see later, make sure you're using the support library version of the fragment related classes. Okay. If it doesn't say support dot something in it along the way, you've imported the wrong class. All right. So there's one fragment. In this fragment, we wanted to have a button. So let's go ahead and change this text view. Instead of having a text view, that takes up the entire screen. That's kind of stupid. Let's drop a button out here. And let's have our button now say hello. Now remember, as I've told you in the past, hard-coded strings are not acceptable. So we're going to want to extract that string to a resource. I'm going to press Alt-Enter and extract that string resource to say hello. So we're referencing things properly. That's one of the most critical best practices you get in the habit with, is using resources for your strings rather than anything else. Okay? And that button is fine just like that. It's kind of look kind of simple for now, but I'd rather focus on it working properly than making things look pretty for now. Okay, so there's that taking place. We've got one fragment in place. Now we need to have our second fragment in place. So let's come and hit New, Fragment, blank, Fragment, and we're going to call this one Fragment Text. Okay, uncheck both the fragment factory methods and uncheck include interface callback. So the only checkbox you'll have again is the create layout XML. Make sure to remove both of those check marks. You'll be able to tell quickly if you've made a mistake, because when your fragment class opens up, it'll be full of all kinds of scary looking stuff. So you can just Control-Z and undo it and try again if you end up forgetting to uncheck one of those boxes. Okay? All right, now for our fragment text, we wanted to have a text view. And now with both the case of our text view and our button view, we're going to need to interface with them in code. So we're going to need to attach an ID to these pieces so that we can find them. Okay, so @+ID / let's call this frag text view. Sure, something simple for now. Frag text view is fine. Okay, likewise, our button already has an ID by default. We're going to just call it button, which is acceptable for now. So we have two fragments, one with a button, one with a text view. They don't really do anything other than right now our fragment, and as part of its life cycle, it will create a view, which is just our fragment text for the text view, or our fragment button XML file that we created for our fragment button. Otherwise, they're not going to do anything. Okay. So if we go ahead and we actually try to launch this now, get my emulator up and running here. There we go. Okay. Let's tell it, go ahead and install that. It's got to do a cold boot. Something you're going to really look forward to is the next version of the emulator that'll be coming out later this summer will boot up in less than a second, which is really, really cool. Okay, installing our APK. Now, our fragment, our app starts up, but we still have hello world. Notice neither our button is visible, nor is our text view. Okay, now I want you to think for just a minute, why are we still seeing the string hello world rather than seeing our button and our text view like we would expect to see? Okay, if you said because we never told the computer to use the fragments, you are absolutely correct. If we come back to our main activity layout, we still are using, the only thing in here is our text view. That's all that's here, was our hello world, which isn't going to do us any good because we want to put fragments in place. Now, when dealing with fragments, we have two different ways we can go about putting a fragment in place. Option number one is we can just embed the fragment itself. We can tell it width and height and all of those pieces. Oh, go away, documentation. And we can drop a fragment in that way. We can also, if we want to put our fragments in procedurally rather than hard-coded in the XML, then the best way to do that is through the use of a frame layout. Okay, oops. Frame layout. Now, frame layouts are really simple layouts. That thing is stupid annoying. Okay, Frame layouts are simple layouts that consist of the ability to hold one thing and one thing only. So in the case of a fragment, that makes a lot of sense. We can have a frame layout to hold the fragment because the only thing that will ever be there is a frame layout, is the fragment itself. Now the fragment can nest children, but I can't have two different layouts. For example, in this frame layout, I could not have like a button and, make this look a little better here. I couldn't have, say, a button and a text view together on the same view hierarchy, because frame layouts are only capable of holding one thing, and this would be holding two things. Okay, I could hold something like a linear layout, for example, and then put as many things as I wanted inside of here. That's okay, because the frame layout's only holding one top-level child. You can go at it either way. It's not a big deal which way you want to go at it. All right, since you used the Frag Manager last week, I think let's go ahead and just embed the fragments directly, just so you can kind of get a feel of how that is. That especially makes sense when we're not going to be dragging or we're not going to be changing fragments around or anything for this particular assignment. So you got two different ways we can do it. Is we can come in and we can use our palette view to drop in a fragment, which is under containers, or you can just do a search. That's the easiest way to do it. We can drop a fragment here. It's going to come up and ask you immediately, which fragment do you want? Well, I want the button fragment on the top, and then we're going to come in and drop another fragment here, and let's put another fragment, which is going to be our text. Okay. Now notice this will fill out the basic pieces. We're going to have a pair of names. You know, the ID names that it comes with are garbage, so we're going to change this out to frag BTN, and let's change this from to frag TV so that we can make it easier to find them in our code. I want the button actually to be on the top, so let's go ahead and move this guy down. Now also, for simplification of this one, I'm going to use a linear layout rather than a constraint layout. We'll come to constraint layouts in a couple of weeks, but for now let's just use a linear layout and set the orientation to vertical. That way our two fragments will stack on top of each other. And then we could use a layout weight if we want. Let's go ahead and set our height to 0 dp, and let's set our weight to 1 on both of these. So I'm going to just copy and paste. So they split the screen half and half. Okay? You can see our two fragments split the screen half and half for height. And then our width, we actually should change this to match parent. Oops. Match parent for both of those. So we can see in our design view now our two fragments each take half of the screen. Or if we wanted to change it, and we could do, you know, put a 2 here, as we talked about last week, and we can make that now change and take 2/3 of the screen. But I'd like it to be half and half, so that's fine for now. We've got our two different fragments in place. All right, so now when we run our project, bring our emulator back. Instead of seeing the hello world piece of text on the screen, we should see our button, which does nothing when we click it, and then our hello blank fragment text. So now we need to start to implement the logic of the fragment itself. So in the fragment for the button, we need to find the button and then attach a click listener to that button so that we can register to handle the logic of those pieces. Now, first off, we have the inflator, which, as we know right now, the onCreate view just inflates our layout and returns it back to the parent or to the fragment itself to handle whatever it needs to do with that layout. However, we're going to want to be able to create or to access part of that layout later on when we use some other life cycle events. So we have two different ways to access it. Later, we can use getView to get a reference to the view, or for performance, I like to just create a private view variable that I call root. And I say root, just assign it along the way. So assign it to root and then go ahead and return it back so that we can use it later. Now, when it comes to lifecycle events for a fragment, the easiest way to go ahead and to handle other lifecycle events, for example, after the create view, in fact, why don't we look at this, get the right place here, Android fragment lifecycle. Let's look at the diagram again. Okay, in our fragment lifecycle, we go through attach, we create view, on activity created, on start, and on resume, and then we should handle various things that take place in these places. You know, for example, if we want to have a button, right? I can't create like we did in the activity. We attached buttons and things like that to our on create. We can't do that in the fragment because if you'll notice, on create view, or the inflation of the actual view, the creation of the button itself doesn't happen until after the fragment has already been created. So we can't access the creation inside of these two different view or life cycles because the order matters here. So we can get a reference to it, and then in a later one, we would is where we would necessarily handle the appropriate listeners. You could put it in on create view if you want. That's where I typically put it. It's, you know, some people like to put it in start, which is another acceptable place to put it because the on start life cycle is designed for when we have the fragment is being initialized for the first time, and then it hasn't been paused. It's not, you know, coming back from a pause state like on resume is. It's just being started the first time. So we can do it either way. It'll be up to you whether we want to use where you want to do it on either on create view or on start. I'm going to go. I think actually let's go ahead and just do it in on start. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's do that. Now, the easiest way to do that is if we right-click in our IDE and we can hit Generate. And we can now choose to override methods. This way we don't have to memorize the signatures for the various pieces. And we can start typing, search for on start, because we want to override on start. It'll put in the method stub for us, the super call, and now we can do whatever it is we want to do in here. In this case, let's get a reference to our button. In fact, let's store that now as a member variable, button. Let's call him BTN. Now, notice this guy is in red, which means I don't know what to do with button. If you press Alt-Enter, we can choose to import the appropriate class, and it will import the class for the button itself. So we want to take our BTN now, and we need to assign it. Okay. Now we're going to get the button itself from the inflated layout. So that's we're going to need to use the find view by ID. Okay. We're going to be finding a button, and it is going to be coming from root. Okay, because root is the bottom of the view. Okay, the activity we could just call find by view, find view by ID. But when we're inside of a fragment, we need to reference the root view. Okay, so we can root dot find view by ID, and we're going to use the ID we made before, ID button. Okay, which is the ID of our button itself. Now you're going to get sometimes a complaint that casting the button is redundant. Ignore that complaint and just leave it there for now. There's reasons why we're going to leave that in place, but we'll explain those later. Okay? I don't want to give you too much moving pieces at once and risk getting you lost. So root.findViewById by ID for finding our button. Okay? Now inside the button itself, we can now set on click listener, and create ourselves an anonymous inner class for our click listener. New on click listener, press enter, and let it auto-generate all of our stuff. Okay, for our anonymous inner class to handle it. Basically meaning, whenever somebody presses this button, what do we want to have happen? Okay, this should be pretty similar to stuff you did in Java in the past. But we have our click listener, which contains a single method. Okay, that our button knows to call when it is clicked, called onClick. And whatever's inside of this method is what will happen whenever the button itself is pressed. Or if you want, for example, there's long press to do for a long click if you want to do that, or short, just regular click. So in our case, we're going to want to do something. So I'm going to just put a to-do for now. To-do button has been pressed. Okay? This gives us our basic pieces of our fragments in place now. Okay? However, the question is rather than just having a to-do, when the user is pressing this button, what do we want to have happen? What's our logical thing? Okay? In our case, for this particular demo, this button simply needs to send a message to our fragment. Okay? In fact, let's do it this way. We're going to create another variable here. We're going to call this private. Let's get an int and count. Set it to 0. Because what I'm going to do for this particular demo is every time we press this button, it's going to count how many times we click it, and the text down here is going to update each time we click it with how many times it has been clicked. Okay? So, our button has been pressed, which means for us, we want to take our count variable and we want to just plus. Okay? We want to increment up our count. Because we're starting at 0, so the first time they click, we're going to say plus is going to be a 1 to tick it up by 1. Okay? So we're going to count it up. But then now and this is where the whole tricky part comes into place, is we need to now send a message to this other fragment. Okay, now in this first example, we're going to show you a hard-coded, down and dirty, simple way to make this happen. It should never happen in a production app, but it'll help the interfaces make a little bit more sense if you see the harder way to do it. Okay, the less flexible, more rigid, maybe that's a better way to place it, is the more rigid way of accomplishing this task. Okay. The way we'll do that is what we're saying then is this fragment needs to call a method on my main activity. So this main activity, we might not have a public method, for example, doesn't return anything, accepts our int count, and this guy will then update frag b. Okay. So. Oh, I guess it helps if I give the method a name, doesn't it? Update. Let's say frag button pressed. Okay? So inside of our fragment button now, we're going to get a reference to our activity, okay, by calling getActivity. And then we are going to call our method. In fact, why don't we store this? This will make a little bit more sense. We're going to store this main activity equals getActivity. Okay. Now notice this is going to go red at first because getActivity returns just a generic activity itself. We're going to want to cast it to our type main activity. Okay. So we're going to take main activity. Now we have a reference to activity. So I can use my reference to activity to call fragment button pressed and pass it a count. Okay. The key problems here that we're going to want to change later is right now I am hard-coded. So the only thing this fragment could ever work with is the main activity. Rather, we're going to use interfaces instead. So that way, as long as whatever thing is holding me implements my interface, it will still function. But right now, where we're hard-coded, that's not the case. If I ever had a different activity use this fragment, everything would blow up. Okay? So that's going to call this method we just made in our main activity. Okay? For our main activity, we're going to need a reference to our fragment itself. So let's call this private fragment. Make sure to pick the support fragment, not the regular fragment, the support fragment. Okay? Let's call him frag B, sure. Or well, let's call him frag TV because that's what we did before. Okay, so we're going to need to get a reference to my fragment text view, and we're going to want to then update that fragment text view. So, all right, so we need to get a reference to our fragment now that we're holding it. So the easiest way to do that again is to use our fragment manager. I've got a snippet of code here. So we're going to do fragment manager, FM and then we're going to get a reference to our support fragment manager. We have to use the support fragment manager again because we are using support fragments and support activities. Okay, so we can maintain backwards compatibility. Then we'll use our fragment manager and find the fragment by ID. Once we have a reference to the fragment itself, now we could then call a method on our frag TV. Now, in fact, if we want, we can take, instead of calling this guy just a generic fragment, we can actually tell it the type of fragment we made, which was our fragment text. Here we will need to do some casting when we do that. Okay, but here's the advantage of doing that now is I can call a method directly on my fragment text. So if I had a method that said, for example, public void update text that took our integer. Okay, now from this main activity, I can call this update text method and pass it the count method parameter that came from before. Okay, so now inside of fragment text, my update text, okay, we're almost done. Again, we're going to want to hold a reference to our root view, so private view root, and we'll assign it. Okay, that way we can access it down later on. Because again, we're going to want to override now. Let's do a generate, a override methods, and let's do on start again. And let's get a reference to our text field. So private text view, let's call it TV. Okay, and then we can say TV equals root.find view by ID, r.id dot, what do we call it, frag text view. Okay, again, we should cast this to a text view. This will help our tooling out. Okay, and there we go. So now inside of our update text, we can say TV dot set text, and we can now pass it a string that we want to use. So we can do the button, oops, the button has been pressed. Concatenate our count variable times. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our application now. So now each time I press my button, press once, twice, 3, 4, 5, we can click it over and over and over, because what's happening is every time I press on this button, this method on click is being called, which, using a reference to our main activity, calls a method on that main activity called frag button pressed. When we call frag button pressed, it gets a reference to our fragment and then updates that text. Now, you may notice too, this doesn't need to happen every time. This really only needs to happen if frag TV is null. If it's null, let's populate it. Otherwise, we don't need to keep asking it to repopulate it. Well, in fact, you'll find that's unnecessarily hard on both the battery and memory. So continually updating a reference when it's unnecessary. It hasn't changed, so we've got our reference. Now we can update it. Okay? So button is pressed here, calls method on activity here, which then calls a method on the third fragment, or the second fragment here, which then updates the text with our appropriate message from there. Okay? Now, this was a hard-coded string. We'll change that out to a resource in a little bit, but for now, I really just want to focus on making sure you're understanding those basic pieces of now the fragment. Notice it doesn't have anything related to button handlers or text fields or things like that. It simply is sending messages between the fragments themselves, okay, between fragment A and fragment B. That's its only job, is to handle communications between the two. It should not be dealing with button handlers in Fragments or inside of tracking fields like that, okay? We're just sending communications between them, then using parameters to send the necessary arguments, okay? So this video is kind of long. Let's stop here, and in the third video we're going to look at now how do we do it the right way? How do we implement interfaces to do this in a flexible and reusable way?